fraud and bribery, selling insurance to a man with Down syndrome, and stealing from the dead. Those are just some of the abuses that Australian financial institutions have admitted to over the course of the 9-month inquiry.
Greed has been the motive, as short-term profits have been pursued at the expense of basic standards of honesty.
The Royal Commission into Australia's financial services sector came to an end on Friday. An interim report in September found firms routinely lied to customers. Some also charged clients for services that were never delivered.
The question that needs to be asked is, how did this culture of greed and selling as the dominant focus, how was that allowed to permeate the sector to produce adverse outcomes for consumers without being stamped out earlier and without the penalties that exist to be properly enforced?
Matt Comin runs the Commonwealth Bank, one of Australia's 4 largest lenders. He was among the bank bosses grilled by investigators in the last 2 weeks.
But as the Chief Executive, of course, one of my primary issues is ensuring that we have a culture which has learned from the areas and issues of misconduct, and we are a very different organisation for our customers going forward.
The Commission will release its full report in February. It will contain recommendations on how to clean up the sector, which are likely to include tougher regulations. It could also call for criminal and civil charges against companies and executives accused of the biggest offences. Usmaan Lone, TRT World.
Well, let's get more on the story from Steve Keen in Amsterdam. He's an economics professor at Kingston University in the UK. Good to have you back with us, Steve. So, as we know, the current Conservative government basically had to be dragged kicking and screaming in order to get this banking inquiry into action in the first place. But now that it's happened over the course of the 9 months, we've heard appalling scandals, executive inaction, and some really bad decisions that have hurt literally millions of customers. Has it been a success in your eyes?
Oh, absolutely. Actually, in terms of how it was actually called, it's a total failure, because the reason that the commission was called in the first place was the banks themselves approached the Prime Minister, who'd blocked about 30 calls by the Labor Party and by the Greens to actually have the inquiry. And they said, look, we want to have the inquiry just to clear the air and to make it obvious that we're quite honest and nothing untoward has occurred under our watch. Of course, it's a complete failure on that front. Once the Royal Commission had the powers to subpoena documents and see what had actually been done by the banks, their behaviour was, if anything, more outrageous than anything that had been put into the papers by the whistleblowers already. So I think it's a magnificent failure, and hopefully it will lead to some serious changes in the banking practices in Australia. But I'm not holding my breath about the regulators finally using the teeth they actually have to enforce good behaviour amongst Australian banks.
And Steve, you and I, we've chatted about this a few times over the course of the inquiry, but remind us about some of the significant abuses that were uncovered during the course of these hearings.
I think the most important is the use of a poverty line as the expenditure level for everybody who was applying for a housing loan. So there's a survey done some decades ago to establish what was the level at which somebody was on poverty, and the level that was that's now revised to for 2 people, pensioners, was regarded as the average expenditure level for people living anywhere in Sydney. So anything over like about $30,000 Australian a year was regarded as being available to pay your mortgage. Now that meant that people were offered mortgages with at least 1.5 times, possibly 2 times as high as they should have been allowed, because the expenditure they had was far higher than the poverty line. And this is what enabled the housing bubble in Australia to go on for so long after the financial crisis in 2008.
And as we heard in that story, the Royal Commission will deliver its final report sometime by February next year. What recommendations would you like to see in terms of how these banks can be sanctioned or punished?
I'd like to see some of them go to jail. That's only happened in Iceland. It should have happened in a lot more countries because the level of fraudulent behaviour runs right through the whole, from the top to the bottom of the organisations. It should be the death knell for the idea that banks can self-regulate. That is actually what led to this problem. There's been 2 or 3 inquiries over years, some of which I've spoken to, which have called for banks to be deregulated and actually self-regulate. Well, this is the product of that. They've self-regulated their way into outright fraud. And I'd also like to see controls on the nature of lending to stop them basically financing asset bubbles. Now, I don't think it'll happen under the Morrison government's watch, but it might well be something that the incoming Labor Party, which is absolutely going to win the next election, might consider doing after they come to power.
And some of the CEOs who have appeared before this inquiry, they have appeared to be contrite for some of the abuses that were uncovered. No doubt their PR departments probably coached them in how to conduct themselves. But do you think as a result of this inquiry, these big 4 banks in Australia, they have learnt their lesson?
No, no way. I mean, for example, Ken Henry, who was ex-Treasury Secretary under Rudd and now runs the NAB, came out saying it might take 10 years to get a decent culture going in the organisation. But if you leave it 10 years, they'll forget this ever happened. So I don't think they have learned their lesson. They're hoping they can, a bit of contrition, as you say, a nice pretense of bowing to the public might be enough to get the hounds off their backs. And that's what really the politicians themselves would like to have happen. Yes, so I think it takes a lot more pressure to bring about real reform of any banking system, especially the Australian banking sector.
February can't come soon enough. Steve, I'm sure we'll talk more about this in the near future. Thanks again for joining us from Amsterdam.